Welcome everyone to the screencast on JavaScript and dynamic web pages, where we'll be talking about client-side processing. We're going to be going over some techniques to create dynamic HTML pages. And what we mean by dynamic HTML is that there's going to be some combination of a markup language, HTML, and a scripting language like JavaScript, which allows us to add some dynamic features into the user interface, into the web pages that users interact with on a website. In discussing this, we're going to get into some side discussions about how you create the look and feel of these pages, and that's largely through CSS, cascading style sheets. And we'll talk about how you can manipulate the pages programmatically using the DOM, the Document Object Model. Basic web pages are static, and these are useful but not very interesting. The information is what it is. It does not change. So this, for example, is a static web page for a section of Business 311, and you could load this web page 1,000 times and it will be exactly the same. This page, on the other hand, is dynamic. If you notice the date up here at the top, if I refresh this page, that date changes, right? So this page is not the same every time you load it. Every time you load the page, the time updates. Okay, that's not really exciting, but it is a kind of dynamism, and we'll see this is just one example of a rich set of capabilities that you can build into your web pages to add all kinds of dynamic features, to add all kinds of interactivity. The way that we get dynamism in web pages is through scripting code, scripting languages that create the pages that we end up interacting with. And there are really two opportunities that you can use scripts to create dynamism. One is on the client side after the page has been requested. So on the client side, you could have, for example, client preferences. I want my background to be dark green, and I want the status bar to be on the right-hand side, not the left-hand side, and I want the temperature units to be Celsius, not Fahrenheit, and so forth. So there can be all kinds of changes that are purely client-side and have nothing to do with what the information that's on the server. But of course, you can also have dynamic information generated on the server side. So every time you do a Google search, Google dynamically runs an auction and generates a web page to respond to those search terms and returns that back to the client. There are lots of scripting languages. PHP is a very popular language that's used on the server side. JavaScript is the most popular scripting language these days and is used primarily but not exclusively for scripting on the client side. And as we'll see in this semester, we'll see examples of using JavaScript in both places. So you can see from the little diagram here that there are opportunities for scripts to be run both on the server side. There's a scripting engine within the server, and on the client side, scripts can be run from your browser. Before we get into a discussion of how this scripting actually works, you need to know a little bit of background and a little bit of terminology. The first thing that you need to know, really important concept that we're going to be dealing with the whole semester, is the DOM, the Document Object Model. So think about those three words. The document, that's the page that you're interacting with, the thing that is rendered by your browser. That's called the document. Each page is its own document. Your browser has a model of that document internally, and it uses that model to figure out how to render it and how to interact with you, with the world. And that model is made up of objects. Objects are representations of the various elements of the model. So here's a variant of the simple page or pages that we created for Lab 2 for the used smartphone store. And I'm gonna click on this and go into my store, and it's rather ugly, but that's not the point of this. The point is that we can understand this page in terms of the DOM, in terms of the document object model. We can inspect these objects, we can look at their properties, we can change their properties, we can play around with them. And this gives us power to do anything, everything from a scripting language. The objects are organized in a tree. So at the top level is the document, and within the document there is a bunch of HTML things, and there's a head, and there's a body, and we've seen this a number of times already. And most of the action is going to go on within the body. That's where you're going to have your various elements, your paragraphs, your headings, your links, and so forth. And these elements, the various objects that we represent in HTML that we're showing to the user, that a user can interact with, have attributes. So one attribute of a link is its href, its reference. Where do you get taken to when you click that link? An element of a property of an element might be something like its text. So this H1 top level header has some text. And you're going to see that we can and will be manipulating these objects that are stored in the DOM. So let's return to my ugly used smartphone store. And what I'm going to do, I'm using the Chrome browser. I'm going to right click and select Inspect. And that's immediately going to bring up an element browser. And well, there's all kinds of things I can do with the inspector, but in particular I want to look at the elements of this smartphone store. And you can see here that we have HTML at the high level. It has a head, it has a body, and as I hover over these things, the various elements are highlighted. We're interested in the body here primarily, and so I can click on that arrow and I can see there's an H1, and now that's highlighted, and you can see that's the heading, use smartphone store, and within that I have a div, a major division or region within the body, and this is where I actually list my various phones. I can open that up and you can see there's a main within that, and there's a whole bunch of items, and I can look at them, and as I hover over each of those items you'll see they're highlighted in the representation. By manipulating the DOM, I can manipulate what the user sees on the page, and I can manipulate the way the page responds to the user. So let's look at a really simple example. Let's say I want to change the title of this page. Right now it's called Use Smartphone Store, and I want to change that title to Really Amazing Smartphone Store. To do that, I have to figure out which element in the DOM I need to manipulate. I need to manipulate this guy up here, which is this H1 Use Smartphone Store over here that I can see in the element browser. Notice that this H1, I've inserted an ID. This is H1 ID equals test. And I inserted that property so that I can specifically manipulate that element. I can find that element in the DOM easily, and I can manipulate it. And the way I'm going to do that is with the console down here. So in the console, I can type in any JavaScript commands that I like, and in particular there are commands that you use for querying and for setting properties of the document. So we refer to the document within JavaScript by typing in document, and then we use a dot, and a dot allows us to now refer to some property of this document or some method or action, some capability that the document gives us. And what I'm going to do is I want to get an element by ID. So notice I started typing get, and it pops up all the possibilities, and I'm going to click on get element by ID, and now I want to give the name of the ID that I want. And we saw that up here. The ID was test. So I'm going to put in a quote, test, and you see I just clicked on that and it's already filling it in for me. And what did I say I want to call it? Rick's Amazing Smartphone Store. And now I'm going to hit return. And voila, the title of this page has been changed. Okay, this is one thing that you can do, but you can use this not just to change text, but to change behaviors. But even changing text is useful. For example, if a customer had a discount code, maybe I would show the discounted version of these prices, and I could do that by identifying within each of these sections which element I was interested in. I would have to identify them somehow, such as giving them a unique ID, and then going in and changing the price located here as one of the properties to whatever the discount is, $30 instead of $40. So this gives you complete control over everything that the user sees and that the user interacts with on the web page. It's pretty powerful. So as we've seen, a scripting language like JavaScript can access and can manipulate the DOM. It accessed the DOM by doing document.getElement by ID. I grabbed an element of this document model, right? The document consists of the HTML stuff, which has a head and a body, and I found inside the body there was a particular H1 element, and I manipulated a particular property of that H1 element. So through JavaScript, I could access and manipulate the DOM. So let's just back up for a moment. What's an object? It's the document object model. What's an object? An object it's just a data structure. It's a way of keeping related information together, a collection of properties. And a property is just a name and a value, right? So the name of the property that I manipulated for that H1 heading a moment ago was called inner HTML. That was the inner value of that HTML object. But a property's value, it doesn't have to be just a piece of text or a picture, a JPEG. I mean, it could be, but it could also be a function. That is, it's a little piece of code that executes when we call that function. And when a property of an object is a function, we call that a method. So we typically refer to objects as having methods. Those are the things that you can do, the verbs essentially that act on the object. And they have properties. That's the information, the nouns, the what part of the objects. So every HTML tag turns into an object in the DOM, and these objects have data, like the stuff in between the tags. If it's a paragraph, it's the text between the P and the /P tags. If it's an image, it's the image location and maybe other properties like its width and its height and its alternate text and so forth. And as we've seen, there are standard ways of accessing the objects and then those properties of the objects so that we can do things such as get their value or set their value. And so there's a ton of information about the properties and methods that you can use on a DOM object. And you can see there's this W3 Schools reference that you should definitely take a look at, because we'll be using this for the rest of the semester. So putting it all together, JavaScript is a scripting language that we can use in the server or in the browser, but we're primarily going to focus on using it in the browser. And we can use this to add dynamism to our pages, to create dynamic HTML pages. So you often see JavaScript within an HTML page enclosed between the script and /script tags. So alert is a JavaScript statement, and the alert statement pops up a little message box with whatever text you have inside. So in this case, it would pop up a message box with the word hello in there, and you could respond to that. But you can do other things. For example, you can specify what happens when a user presses a button by specifying the onClick method of that particular button object. So notice I'm using the words that I just defined for the referring to objects, which are part of the document object model. You need to get used to this lingo. Again, we're going to be using it for the rest of the semester. And fortunately, there's not too many more terms that you need to know about objects and the document object model, but you do need to become comfortable with this notation and with this nomenclature, with this way of naming things. So JavaScript is most often run by the client in the browser to make pages dynamic. So let's go back to the example that we began the screencast with. Okay, so this is not a very beautiful page, but this was our first example of a dynamic page. And you see now that the time has advanced even a little further since we first saw it. And this would just be a typical form that you could interact with. Comments, love your website. And then, we can interact with this. And when we click the submit button, an alert pops up. And we can respond to this. Okay, thanks for entering the data. And the form reloads, resets itself. Okay, not a very exciting web page, but this allows us to see one example of dynamism. When I click that submit button, the alert box came up. And I made it do that by setting a method on the submit button. So the submit button is another type of HTML object, just like a paragraph or an image or an anchor or an H1 heading. We have various kinds of HTML object types that we can use to interact with the user. So we see things like radio buttons, which we were using to ask the user to choose their favorite color, and a submit button. And a method of the submit button is onClick. Remember, methods are the things that they're the verbs, they're the actions, they're the things that can query or change the state of the object. And in this case, what we're saying is when the button is clicked, execute this little tiny bit of JavaScript code, which is to pop up an alert box, and we're going to specify that within that alert box we have the message thanks. This tiny little example uses all of the things that we described. This is an HTML document. It has a head. It has a body. It has a very small amount of scripting, this alert box here, and a script up here to get the time. It also has a style sheet, a very simple style sheet that I use to set the color of the font to blue and the font size to 20 pixels. And that allowed me to create this very simple first example of a dynamic HTML page. Everything you're going to be doing this semester is really just an elaboration of these concepts. You will be building increasingly sophisticated web pages with increasingly sophisticated scripting so that they're dynamic, so that they interact with the user in reasonable ways. You will specify their look and feel using styles, primarily through separate CSS files, but some of it may be inline as well, or in the header like the example that I showed here. Yeah, so really the rest of the semester is just an elaboration of these concepts, adding more sophistication, adding more tools and tips and tricks. So now would be a really excellent time for you to go back to the readings for these readings on dynamic web pages and review them. What are dynamic web pages, JavaScript and the HTML DOM, and introduction to JavaScript. Enjoy.